Okay, well, welcome everybody. We're gonna go ahead and get started. It's 7 o'clock. So welcome to our presentation this evening, Hot Fun in the Summertime. This is a community collaboration between the Ball State University Libraries, Delaware County Historical Society, and the Muncie Public Library. This presentation is also being recorded and will be made available through the Ball State University Library's digital media repository. First things first, we have some housekeeping rules. You are free to have your video on. Normally we have a large amount of participants, but since it is the summer, if you want to turn your video on, that's fine. For the time being, we have muted everybody. There will be a time for questions between each segment and at the end of the presentation. If you wish to ask a question, you can use the chat box. The button to access the chat is located in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Just make sure that the chat box is labeled to, the label field is to everyone. This way, all participants can see the question. If you wish to ask your question verbally, we ask that you raise your hand. This function is also in the toolbar under the reaction button and located at the bottom of the options, as you can see on the screen in front of you. So right now, I'm going to ask that everyone who is able to enter into the chat that they can hear and see our presentation slides. Okay, we got one yes, we got two yeses. Okay. So let's start with some introductions. I am Sara, Allison, Head of Archives User Engagement at Ball State University Libraries, Archives and Special Collections, and I will be your moderator. This evening, we will be hearing from Melissa Gentry, who is the supervisor in the GIS Research and Map Collection at Ball State University Libraries and a founding member of the Notable Women of Muncie and Delaware County Committee for the Delaware County Historical Society. Sara McKinley is the Local History and Genealogy Supervisor of Muncie Public Library and manager of the Carnegie Library. And Karen Vincent is the Delaware County Historian, president of the Delaware County Historical Society, and a founding member of the Notable Women Project Committee of the Delaware County Historical Society. So let's give them all a virtual round of applause. Yay! Bygone summertime in Muncie meant days of lemonade, butterflies, root beer floats, cold Coca-Cola, sunburns, and straw hats. The fairgrounds also hosted fireworks and horse races and picnics. McKinley Park was crowded with baseball games, picnics, band concerts, and family reunions. City folks rode the streetcar to Westside Park for roller skating, a roller coaster, and even hot air balloon rides on the 4th of July. Kirk's Bike Shop and McNaughton's sold firecrackers and flags. Movie theaters offered air-conditioned escapes, and parents took children dressed in their pajamas to the drive-in movie theaters. Swimmers cooled off and frolicked in the river and quarries and at swimming holes and pools around the city. And families traveled near and far for adventures and beaches or to slow down and enjoy the sunshine and lightning bugs. And kids went to summer camp. So our first presenter this evening will be Karen Vincent.
Thank you, Sara. Oh, many people from this area escaped the hot fun in Muncie at their Indiana lake cabins at Wawasee, Tippecanoe, Barbie, Webster, and many other lakes. 3 of the 5 Ball brothers and their families did the same, but they chose for their summer homes a spot on the northwest side of Michigan in the town of Leland in Leelanau County. Next slide, please. Located between Lake Michigan and Lake Leelanau, the Indiana Woods section of Leland is a beautiful place, and I can understand why the descendants of the Frank C., Edmund B., and Lucius L. Ball families still spend time there, well more than 100 years after the first family visited. And just a note before I continue, all of the images in this slideshow are from the Minnetrista Heritage Collection, unless otherwise noted. And thanks go to Melissa Gentry for creating this map. Next slide, please. I'll start with a very brief history of Leland and Leelanau County. There are differences in historic accounts, of course, but most historians seem to agree that the land lying between Lake Michigan and what is now called Lake Leelanau was secluded and mostly unknown to white people as late as the 1850s. Native people, including the Chippewa and Ottawa, occupied the area of dense pine trees and maple, birch, and poplar trees. The Native Americans coexisted with wolves, foxes, mink, otter, skunks, and black bears. And of course, there was seemingly endless supply of fish in the two lakes. And that's the way it was until Antoine Manceau came to Leland. He staked out his claim on Carp River, now known as the Leland River, in 1848, and returned in June 1853, beginning the white settlement of Leland. Antoine, his son, and their partner built a dam and erected a water-powered sawmill. Other families soon arrived and docks were built. Ships started tying up at these docks and more settlers arrived. And by 1867, the village of Leland had a population of approximately 200. For about the next 30 years, the town was sustained by the lumber industry and ironworks. But by 1900, both of those industries were winding down. At about the same time, according to historian Joseph Little, venturesome people from the hot Southlands began to come to Traverse City by rail, take the Manistee and Northeastern train to Fouch, then travel by steamer to Leland. These resorters breathed new life into Leland. Hotels were built and the townspeople began to cater to these newcomers. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the Ball family. Now, as one story goes, Sara, in the middle, wife of Lucius, had some friends in Fort Wayne who told her about a small village on Lake Michigan with an ideal summer climate. Probably sometime around 1903, Sara and Lucius made the trip to Leland with their daughter Helen and their niece Lucy. The plan was to travel from Traverse City to Leland, look around, and return to Traverse City. Next slide, please. Plans changed, however, as somehow Lucy got wet. According to her sister Margaret, she fell into the lake, but which lake isn't mentioned. Another story states that Lucy was trying to put out a smoldering fire in the woods and fell into some water. Anyway, she got wet, and by the time her clothes dried, it was too late to return to Traverse City. Lucius, Sara, Helen, and Lucy spent the night at the Riverside Inn. Next slide, please. There's also a slightly different origin story that makes some sense. In it, Frank Ball came to Traverse City to consult with an architect. The account didn't give the name of the architect, but my guess is that it was Marshall Mahurin of Fort Wayne, and I'll come back to Mahurin in a few minutes. In this alternative story, the architect suggested to Frank that Leland might be a good place for him to have a summer home, and that he ought to drive to Leland to look around. Frank and his family did so. Lucy still falls in the water, although this time she stepped on a log and fell in Lake Leelanau, necessitating the overnight stay. Also, according to this story, after the family was in bed, Frank walked around the village and discovered the area that was called Indiana Woods by the resorters from Fort Wayne. Now, here's why I think that Marshall Mahurin was the person who suggested Leland as a summer spot. Mahurin is an architect with a firm in Fort Wayne, and he designed the remodel of the Frank Ball home, which occurred at about the same time the family discovered Leland. He also designed the William Ball home and the E.B. Ball home. Mahurin's name also shows up in some deeds for property in Leland. So Frank started checking out properties and asking about prices in this very early trip to Leland. Now, whichever story might be true, Lucy did declare herself responsible for the family deciding to build their homes in Leland. She said, well, of course, now it's full of all our family and others, but when anyone begins to tell about there being old timers and all, I say, now, wait a minute. None of you would have been there if it hadn't been that I fell in the water. Next slide, please. The various accounts of how the Ball family came to Leland and how and when homes were built continue from staying at the Riverside Inn to camping in the woods to slapping together cottages. And here are a few of the stories. Excuse me. For a couple of years, Frank C. family members stayed at the Riverside Inn or rented a cabin. Apparently, according to Margaret, a bed bug infestation in a rented cabin led to FC building the home for his family. FC may also have erected a wigwam or maybe just a tent. They obviously did camp at times, and this photo of FC was taken at Leland. There is another story that FC had 3 small cottages built, with one especially for J. Otis Adams and his wife, Winifred. And Winifred, of course, was a sister to Frank's wife, Bessie. That cabin, the story goes, had 2 large windows and a second floor room to catch the northern light. Next slide, please. And here's a photo of the FC family home under construction around 1909. According to Edmund F. Ball, son of Edmund B. and Bertha, he first summered at Leland when he was 6 months old. So that would be the summer of 1905. Bertha, one of her Vassar classmates, and Ed stayed in a red-in cabin. Ed noted that there was no inside plumbing or running water, and a tray taken from a trunk was used for his crib. Next slide, please. For the next few years, the E.B. family did not return to Leland and instead vacationed on the East Coast. And now by this photo that was taken in Atlantic City, I'd say that Ed was either unhappy about not being in Leland or about wearing that hat. Next slide, please. When the E.B. family did return to Leland, they used the FC cabin since that family was traveling abroad. The E.B. family had such a good time that they decided to return the next year. They rented a cabin again and for the next several years before building. And this map that's shown here is from 1981, but it is fairly similar to earlier maps. It shows how the property was divided in Indiana Woods, which of course, as you can see, bordered on Lake Michigan. You can see, if you look very closely, you can see the names Ball, Owsley, Fisher, and Petty on this map. You can also see that other families have homes in Indiana Woods. Next slide, please. And here are the architectural plans for the E.B. Ball home, dated 1916. And that makes sense since he bought property in Leland that year. Unfortunately, I can't make out the architect's signature, but it's possible it might have been Mahurin or somebody from his architecture firm. Next slide, please. So a few more stories about their time in Leland. Household staff often came with the families for the summer. Mary and Fred Lamb came with the E.B. Ball family for many years. Ed Ball said that Mary was a counselor, teacher, disciplinarian, an unforgettable character. And also, according to Ed, Mary was especially known for her butterscotch pies. In an oral history that is housed at Ball State's Archives and Special Collections, Mary and Fred's daughter, Rosemary, said, "I had been raised with Balls, and they didn't make a difference with me. You know, I would go to Leland, Michigan, where they have a summer home, and go in the lake and go swimming with them. Just everything. I mean, I was like one of them. And we had our own cottage, and it was very nice, very nice. But they really have quite a family, don't they?" The girl in the photo with on the left with Adelia, usually called Diggy Ball, isn't identified, but it might very well be Rosemary Lamb. Getting to Leland in the early years was no easy feat. Everything needed for the summer had to be packed in trunks. A train took the family to Traverse City, then to Fouch at the south end of Lake Leelanau. There they would take the steamer, the Leelanau, to the banks of the Leland River. From there, they still had to get all their trunks to Indiana Woods. Sometimes a freight car would be loaded with supplies and with the FC family's pony Fred and his cart. Fred apparently balked a bit at going up the hills and would not move until everyone got out of the cart and walked. In later years, trunks would be shipped to Sutton's Bay and taken by the driver to the summer homes. And the drivers usually were Ball Brothers Company employees. And one more short story before I go on. Diggy and Rosemary Ball participated in the Leelanau Historical Pageant held in August 1924. Girls from Leelanau County portrayed states, land, and sky girls, wood nymphs, and hours. And that's like the 60 minutes an hour. Diggy and Rosemary were hours. But unfortunately, the program I saw from the pageant isn't complete. So I have no idea what the hours did. Next slide, please. Aunt Sara, on the left in the water, wife of Lucius L. Ball, was known as the fun aunt. Margaret said that she had a jolly sense of humor and that the kids would gather in the LL cabin to play cards, including Finch, Slapjack, and Spit in the Ocean. Elizabeth, Betty Ball, on the right, wrote to her grandmother Woodworth that Aunt Sara always wanted one more hand of cards. Even though George and Francis didn't have a cabin at Leland, Betty often accompanied her cousins there. And in another letter to her grandmother Woodworth, Elizabeth described the sunsets over Lake Michigan. Wish you could have been here for the sunsets the last 2 nights. After the sun went down, the clouds began to color, first yellowish, then flame color, and died out into rose. And I had to include this quote because Minnetrista has home movies from the FC family with lots and lots of shots of sunsets, all in black and white. Next slide, please. Janice Ball married John Fisher at her mother's summer home on August 10th, 1940. I would love to see this wedding dress in color. Minnetrista has a color home movie, which is identified as the reception for their wedding, which was held at the Leelanau Country Club. But unfortunately, John and Janice aren't in it. Next slide, please. So here are just a few more photos of summer activities in Leland. Fishing. Uncle Lucius was a favorite among the children. He always had time, Ed Ball said, to take the nephews fishing. Lucius didn't discriminate against the nieces either. Margaret remembered when they fished from a rowboat in the river. When they hit a stump, Lucius lost his hat and some of his fishing gear. There's nothing to indicate Lucius's reaction, but the nieces and nephews thought the trip was great fun. So on the photo on the left is E.B. Ball, and the gentleman with him could very well be Fred Lamb. On the right is Edward Adams, son of J. Otis and Winifred Beatty Adams. Next slide, please. So there were a wide variety of boats used at Leland, everything from the launches to the rowboats. Much of the boating, however, was done on Lake Leelanau, even though the houses faced on Lake Michigan. But Lake Leelanau generally is much smoother than Lake Michigan. Next slide, please. Swimming and beach parties. It was at the beach party, one of the beach parties, that Frank reminisced, saying, "We built a fire on the beach and fried bacon, scrambled eggs, and had coffee. In fact, we had a regular picnic just like the good old days." Next slide, please. Leland has inspired artists for many years. The watercolor on the left was done by Susan Ryan Marsh, a well-known Muncie artist who visited the Ball family at Leland. And the one on the right is Fishtown, but is unfortunately not signed. And both of those are in the Minnetrista collection. And then next slide, please. J. Otis and Winifred Brady Adams had a cabin next to the FC family. And Margaret, daughter of FC and Bessie, and an aspiring artist, enjoyed going to Aunt Winnie and Uncle Jack's cabin to watch them paint. But they often got tired of her watching them and sent her packing. These two paintings are by J. Otis Adams, both of Indiana Woods. The one on the left is in a private collection, and the one on the right is at the David Owsley Museum of Art. And many Ball family members still regularly spend time at Leland, and some of the descendants live there full-time in the area. And I can definitely see why they do. It's a beautiful place.
Well, thank you, Karen. Are there any questions? You can go ahead and put them into the chat or raise your hand if you want to ask them verbally. I had a quick question. Since it was such a long journey to get there and, trains, moving steamer trunks, how long did they actually stay?
Usually the women would go up and stay an entire summer from, maybe around July 4th to Labor Day. The men did come up on the weekends and did the whole train, boat, and various forms of transportation until later. Several of the men of the second generation had pilot's license, so they would fly.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, doesn't look like it. But if there are, you guys, we can save them for the end of the presentation as well. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our next presenter, who will be Melissa Gentry.
Okay, so tonight I'm going to be talking about the favorite summer pastime of swimming. And of course, I will be mentioning some of the notable women from Muncie. This is actually a different notable woman. This is Joan Collins. But I just thought it was a cool picture. But all the rest of the photographs that you'll see are really great photographs from the Ball State Digital Media Repository and from newspapers.com. So go ahead and go to the next slide. These are some great photographs from the DMR. In the earliest history of Muncie, perhaps the word swimming is a misnomer. A more accurate verb would be bathing, which is where we get the idea of a bathing suit. Typically, mostly males would venture into the White River or local stone quarries to cool off. And sadly, many of these bathers did not know how to swim. It was almost like a traditional rite of summer for the newspapers to report the first drowning each year, especially in the icy cold, deep waters of those stone quarries. Muncie Central High School student Fred Wiggs wrote in the yearbook, quote, "Let the boys enjoy this pleasure while they may, because the ocean, beach, the lakes, the fine pools are not to be compared with the old swimming hole for pure, unadulterated enjoyment. Because there, boys aren't encumbered with hampering bathing suits," unquote. Fred even wrote that he pitied the girls who never know the pleasure of the swimming hole. And I couldn't find any newspaper articles that mentioned girls swimming in the river or the quarry to cool off. Next slide. In fact, most of the articles about women swimming mentioned that they weren't strong enough to really swim too far from the shore. In an 1895 Muncie newspaper article, one bold woman told a restrictive lifeguard to mind his own business regarding how far she could swim from the shore. But most of the focus on women swimming was on the modesty, or lack thereof, of women's bathing suits, many of which were made of wool and included stockings. Next slide. But for the boys, or as it says in this article, the little fellas of Muncie, finding a proper swimming hole was an annual challenge. As the city became more industrial, the White River became a dumping ground for trash and chemicals. In 1905, the Muncie Morning Star reported that, quote, "Before oil was discovered, there were several holes in the White River at which were wont to gather and enjoy a bath, but since the river has become so oily, they had to look for other waters," unquote. And a popular stone quarry at that time was fenced off by its owners. Next slide. So in 1905, a group of innovative boys went swimming in an 8-foot deep pool set up in front of the grandstand at the fairgrounds. The pool was the site of the popular horse diving at the Delaware County Fair. That's right, beginning in the early 1900s, a popular attraction at the county fair was the diving horses named King and Queen. And you can see the show schedules here at the fair. Next slide. Here's a photo of a woman riding one of the diving horses that became national sensations. But the diving horses at the Muncie Fair were unmanned. Next slide. And there is a YouTube video if you're interested in seeing a horse diving off of a high tower. Incidents like that, coupled with the numerous drownings, led to calls nearly every summer for a proper swimming pool. A 100 by 35-foot pool with water up to 6 feet deep was opened at Westside Park in 1905, the first institution of the kind to be opened in Muncie. Swimmers could rent bathing suits from the pool management. And at a meeting at the Whiteley neighborhood, it was suggested that a pool be built in the middle of the White River. Next slide. Finally, after decades of drownings and swimming with oil and horses, Muncie opened one of the stone quarries as a swimming center called Phillipps Pool in July of 1923. Next slide. Phillipps Pool was located just off of East Washington Street near the White River, and it's still a diving quarry today, and you can get on Google Images and see the scuba divers training there at Phillipps Pool. The pool was 400 feet wide and 600 feet long and had a reported depth of 60 feet. Quote, the swimming pools are constructed of wood and consist of 3 large pools with 3 smaller pools adjacent, unquote. Next slide. The smaller pools had wooden bottoms. 2 of the pools were 7 feet deep, 2 were 3 to 4 feet deep, with a smaller pool averaging 20 inches for small children. A huge 3-level diving tower was also constructed of wood. Next slide. My favorite wooden contraption at the pool was the giant wooden log roll. As you can see here, the boys playing on it. How many teeth were lost to that activity? And the newspaper reported that one child received a nasty wound from a jagged nail on the wooden slide. So yes, there was a wooden slide, which I would think there would be a lot of splinters too. Next slide. Social and charity clubs immediately began hosting so-called splash parties at the facilities, and sightseeing groups from outside the city frequently visited these pools. And you can see the diving tower in this picture. Next slide. The newspaper wrote, quote, the pools are appreciated, especially by the women and the girls of the city, as they afford them the only place in the city for swimming at this time. The boys could also swim at the YMCA, unquote. And then here on the left is Karen Vincent's father at Phillips Pool. Next slide. Then in the summer of 1934, the jewel of the Muncie Park swimming pools was opened in Tui Park, thanks to Depression-era works projects. Next slide. Here's a photo of the Tui Pool with a non-wooden slide. Note, it's not a coincidence that all of the swimmers are white. Muncie pools were unofficially or de facto segregated. Next slide. Also by the 1930s, the Delaware County Country Club also had a pool. According to Muncie icon Betty Kendall, notable woman Marjorie Kitzelman of the Hazelwood Mansion, shown here on the left, once telephoned her father, Alva Kitzelman, to deliver a dump truck full of ice into the country club pool on one particularly hot day. The ice arrived within the hour. Next slide. African-American swimmers in Muncie, however, were limited to using the Jackson Park pool, which was described as, quote, at its best, a makeshift pool, just something to quiet the voters' mouths, unquote. And this pool was often in disrepair. Next slide. Jackson Park was located between 2nd and 3rd Streets off Monroe, where the smaller Millennium Place Park is located today. Next slide. In 1941, the Jackson Park pool was closed for repairs. The city threatened to close Jackson Park completely, permanently in 1943, and African-American readers of the newspapers made their opinions known. It was a classic case of taxation without representation due to segregation. One writer described seeing white children enjoying Tui Pool on a hot summer day and then passing by a group of Black children playing in the water of a garden hose. And I like the letter that you see in the middle. It says there's Tui Park Pool with a modern swimming pool for whites only. There's Heacon Park with a wading pool for whites only. And there's McCulloch Park with a ball diamond for whites only. And they're talking, these letters from African-American readers were talking about they pay the taxes for those pools and they're not allowed to use them. Jackson Park only remained open through 1947. Next slide. In 1954, the city reopened the Phillips Quarry as Municipal Pool. 3 African-American lifeguards manned the pool, including notable woman Georgianne Baker, who was an acclaimed cellist at the orchestra at Muncie Central High School. You can see her there on the left. Both African-Americans and whites used these accommodations at the Phillips Municipal Pool. Next slide. In spite of the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court ruling that outlawed so-called separate but equal, the Tui Park remained segregated. It was whites only. Next slide. And in June of 1956, Muncie civil rights leader and director of the Madison Street YMCA, Roy Bewley, accompanied 3 African-American boys to Tui Pool. The group paid their admission and went swimming. A group of white boys began harassing the swimmers and threatened violence that night, so the police closed the pool. The city closed both pools, both Municipal and Tui, for a week, and after some short-lived trouble at night and 20 arrests, the mayor reopened Tui Pool as an integrated facility. This is just one case in a nationwide trend of civil rights activism that occurred at swimming pools. Next slide. And you can't talk about swimming in Muncie without mentioning notable woman Ida Lang Keener, wife of Frank Keener of the meatpacking firm. Ida was a national champion diver from Detroit who won a spot at the 1924 Olympics, although she did not attend. She was featured in the August 1928 Physical Culture magazine. These are the photographs on the left from that magazine, which is also available in the DMR, where she was praised for overcoming polio as a child to become a diving star. She moved to Muncie in the 1940s and taught swimming to disadvantaged children, hosted benefits for children, and provided weekly swimming parties for the Girl Scouts. Next slide. Following the death of her husband, Ida, at age 56, embarked on a national diving tour with divers half her age. News of her performances off the 20-foot high dive was in the papers from Florida to Idaho to Hawaii, and the Los Angeles Times did a full-page story on Ida. She was a sensation. From that article, quote, "Looking like a movie starlet, Ida, poured into a glove-tight bathing suit, climbs up the tower. She passes for 30 up close, 20 in midair, and comes out of her routine looking like 15. When the audience is informed that she's nearly 60, strong men swoon and business buckles," unquote.
Thank you, Melissa. If anyone has any questions, you can put it into the chat, or we can unmute you and you can ask them verbally, or you can wait till the end of the presentation if you want. I do have kind of not necessarily a question, but a comment. You'd mentioned the wool suits and stockings. That just sounds awful. I mean, just why would you want to go swimming in something like that, or even bathing in something like that?
And it was a really big deal. Like, you can see pictures on the internet where they're measuring the length of women's bathing suits. They had these bathing machines that kind of look like a small, almost like an outhouse that were on wheels. And the women would get in those, and then the men would pull them out into the water so the women could change into their bathing suits. And they would swim like next to the little bathing machine so that people from the shore wouldn't see them in their bathing suits. So there's a whole rabbit hole that you can get into of women's bathing suits.
And Sarah McKinley, I love your comment. Yes, there is a movie called Wild Hearts Can't Be Broken, which is about diving horses and was one of my favorite movies as a kid. Absolutely loved it. So, okay. Well, we're going to go on to our next presenter, who is Sarah McKinley.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so I will be talking about drive-in theater history in Muncie. If you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. Just as an introduction, one of my favorite childhood memories and something I've always associated with summer was going to drive-in movie theaters. I remember our family packing a plastic cooler and blankets, a pitcher of Kool-Aid and bags of air pop popcorn or candy. I remember the sound of rubber tires rolling over gravel as we crept our vehicle down the lot to look for a parking spot, an anxious feeling hoping that we would get close to the screen. I remember the sounds of children running in their flip-flops across the gravel to buy concessions or laughing as they tried to catch lightning bugs. Our parents usually sat in our vehicle while us kids sat in the front of the car on lawn furniture. If the mosquitoes were biting, we'd move back into the car where a burning PIC mosquito repellent coil was on the dashboard. I remember the slight crackling sound of the movie audio on the thick metal speakers that we hung from the car window, and generally just loving every minute of the experience. It didn't even matter if the movie was good. Movies were usually a double feature, and our parents could almost always guarantee that we'd be asleep before the end of the second film, as cars crept quietly back through the gravel parking lots to drive home on a starry night down country roads. Now, before I began my research, to my recollection, Muncie had only had 2 drive-in theaters, the Muncie DriveIn and the SkyHigh, but as I dug deeper into my research, I found that that wasn't the case. There was actually a drive-in theater and open air theaters that predated even the Muncie Drive-In. Next slide, please. So the predecessor of drive-in theaters in the early 20th century were open air theaters. Once drive-in theaters began to open, the term open air theater even carried over sometimes, as that was basically the same concept, just minus the cars. The 3 open air theaters in Muncie were all located downtown, just 1 or 2 blocks from each other, and they only existed for about 5 years between 1911 and 1916. They were the Lyric Air Dome, the Coliseum Air Dome, and the High Street Sky Dome. Admission to the theaters was usually 5 cents or 10 cents, depending on the feature or the age group. The Lyric Air Dome was open from at least 1911 to 1915 on South Mulberry between Adams and Jackson Streets. The theater would host not only films, but also the occasional outdoor church service. The Coliseum opened May 10th, 1912 at 115 West Adams Street and operated until 1916. The theater consisted of a large fireproof cement structure and the largest motion picture screen at the time in Muncie. Seating capacity was 1,000, and it was reportedly packed to capacity every night for at least the first year. The High Street Sky Dome was open at 119 South High Street from 1913 to 1914. Next slide. 3 decades later, just after World War II, outdoor theaters gained popularity again, and Muncie's first drive-in theater opened. This very short-lived drive-in was called the Auto Park Theater, and it was located on Tillotson between State Road 32 and the river. The theater was opened by 4 brothers from Indianapolis: Clarence Taylor, Ray Barker, Forrest Morrow, and Maurice Harrison. The brothers erected a 30 by 40-foot screen facing north, and across from that, a concrete building to serve as the projection booth. Instead of individual car speakers, they had an outdoor speaker system for the whole theater, which could park between 400 to 450 cars. The brothers must have dedicated themselves to the endeavor, as they even lived on the theater grounds when it first opened on July 27th, 1946. The first films shown here, films shown were My Reputation, starring Barbara Stanwyck, and Frisco Kid with James Cagney. It's not known for sure why the theater didn't succeed, but just after their second summer of operation, the theater was for sale to the highest bidder in September of 1947. It's possible that they were driven out by their competition, as the Muncie Drive-In Theater opened nearby that same summer. Next slide. The Muncie Drive-In Theater opened July 3rd, 1947, just west of Muncie city limits on State Road 32 across from Warner Gear. They ran 2 nightly shows, rain or clear, with their first show beginning at dusk. They also had midnight shows every Saturday. The theater was advertised as, quote, entertainment for the whole family, and, quote, ideal for shut-ins. Unlike the Auto Park Theater, the Muncie Drive-In had individual car speakers with fingertip controls, which could be one of the reasons that it was more successful. Next slide. Here are some of the movie ads for the Muncie Drive-In Theater over the years. Some of the ads in the 1960s even advertised free pony rides for the kids. The theater showed everything from kids' movies to B-movie monster flicks, romance, westerns, dramas, beach party musicals, and later blockbuster movies like Star Wars. Next slide. 3 years after the Muncie Drive-In opened, the SkyHigh Drive-In Theater was constructed north of the city at the intersection of State Roads 3 and 28 by the Muncie Drive-In Theater Land Company, the same company that owned and operated the Muncie Drive-In on State Road 32. The new SkyHigh was supervised by Robert E. Simmons, who also managed the Muncie Drive-In, and Gordon Benke was resident manager. The SkyHigh cost $100,000 to construct, and it boasted the latest in theater technology. Next slide. The new 600-car theater had 11 car ramps and occupied 20 acres of land. The theater itself was enclosed with a shining corrugated aluminum fence. The screen tower, also covered with corrugated aluminum, was one of the tallest in the state 64 feet high and 55 feet wide, providing a picture 37 feet high and 45 feet wide, visible from the 11th ramp of cars. In the center of the theater stood the projection building, which also housed large restrooms and a refreshment stand. In the front of the projection building was a patio with tables and chairs for theater patrons who wished to sit comfortably outside while eating. The refreshment stand included speakers and was constructed in such a way that patrons could still see and hear the picture while waiting in line. The theater included the most modern equipment for its time, including large car speakers with 5-inch cones for better sound quality. Bright pylon lights lit the entrances from the highway, and downlights illuminated the driveways, making it easier for movie patrons leaving and returning for concessions or restrooms to find their vehicles in the dark. A free playground was provided for children who arrived early, complete with swings, teeter-totters, slides, and a small merry-go-round. The SkyHigh Drive-In Theater opened August 19, 1950, and their grand opening film was the 1950 Western Barricade. Next slide. Here are some of the SkyHigh movie ads from over the years. At some point, the SkyHigh added a second smaller screen, so they were able to show 2 films at the same time. In the 1973 ad for the theater's Giant Scream show, the SkyHigh really hyped up their horror movie marathon, advertising $10,000 free insurance against, quote, death by fright, and promising monsters would escape from the screen and meet you face to face. Next slide. The SkyHigh also held charitable events, at least in the 1950s, in which 100% of the proceeds from a benefit show would go to a particular organization, such as the Fraternal Order of Police Lodge or the Muncie Boys Club. At the concession stand, you could not only get the usual theater fare like popcorn, candy, nachos, or pretzels, but you could even get a full fried chicken dinner complete with hot buttered rolls. Next slide. One of the unique films that they showed in 1960 at the SkyHigh was a 16mm film reel of everyday life in Muncie from 1936. The film reel was played in addition to the regular feature. Decades later, the film was rediscovered in the Rivoli Theater. A VHS version was digitized by Ball State, and it's currently available to watch on the Ball State Digital Media Repository. The film includes panning shots of workers at their businesses, crowds going about their activities around town, Ball State activities, children performing dance numbers, and even a dog playing piano and operating a cash register. This is a 40-second excerpt from the film Your Own Hometown, Muncie, Indiana. If you'd like to go ahead and play that, Sara. Okay, so that's just a 40-second excerpt. I'm going to share the link to the full video in the chat for anybody who'd like to watch it later. Melissa had asked me during our run through where these boys were running. That's actually the original Wilson Junior Senior High School, which is now where the Wilson apartments are next to the Mering Hunt Library. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. All right. So the Muncie Drive-In's final season was in 1986. Vern Young, president of Theatrical Managers, Inc., stated the poor attendance was the cause of the drive-in's closing and blamed other sources of entertainment, such as home movies, for the nationwide failure of drive-ins. Young said that he wished he could pinpoint why people were no longer going to drive-ins, as he felt they were still a bargain for couples with children and cheaper than hiring a babysitter. The Muncie Drive-In was demolished a short time later after the screen was damaged in a storm, but the company kept the SkyHigh in operation for almost another 20 years. This satellite view from Google Maps shows where the Muncie DriveIn used to be located, which is now a parking lot across from the former Warner Gear lot and next to the Hickory Haven Mobile Home Park. Next slide. In 2005, the SkyHigh also saw a drastic drop in ticket sales, but remained hopeful about reopening the following year. Those hopes, however, were dashed when Indiana became the 48th state to observe daylight saving time statewide following Eastern Standard Time. This meant that sunset and therefore movie start times would be later in the evening, which was another downside for moviegoers, especially with children. After the SkyHigh closed, there were several petitions and efforts to try to save the theater, but Muncie's last drive-in was ultimately demolished in 2016. Next slide. Star Press reporter Keith Royston shared these photos that he took of the SkyHigh's remaining structures before it was demolished, including the screen. In recent years, Muncie Map Company in downtown Muncie paid homage to the SkyHigh Drive-In with this retro t-shirt using the classic logo. Next slide. Even though Delaware County doesn't have any drive-in theaters left, fret not. There are still 20 drive-in theaters left in the state of Indiana. The bar graph here shows the number of drive-in movie theaters operating in Indiana over the years. You can see that they peaked at 125 in 1958, and their popularity began to wane in the 70s and 80s. The map on the right shows where each of the remaining theaters are located. The closest one to Muncie is now the Hummel Drive-In Theater to the east in Winchester, which has 2 screens and opens the gates at 8 p.m. with movies beginning at dusk. Next slide. So our last slide here, I wanted to cover that although few true drive-in theaters still survive, many saw a huge comeback in 2020 as they were sort of rediscovered as a safer form of entertainment during the COVID-19 pandemic. Families could remain in their social bubbles and sit in their cars or sit in the fresh air and still get out of the house to enjoy a film on the big screen. Even pop-up drive-in or open-air theater events began to emerge more with inflatable screens. So who knows, maybe one day we'll see new drive-in theaters constructed, but in the meantime, we still have opportunities to enjoy them in East Central Indiana this summer. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Anyone who has any questions or comments, feel free to put them into the chat. I was wondering if you knew, were they during the day, were they used in any way, shape, or form, and what did they do during the winter? Did it just stay empty?
At least based on the research that I did, because I was still pretty young. Well, they closed when I was in college, the last one did, but from what I saw in the papers, they were open from April through October. And they would always announce in the paper, you know, when they were opening for the season and when they were closing for the season. But I didn't really see anything advertised for other events. So I don't know, maybe somebody that's attending might know if they did. The only thing I think I saw was possibly a car show at one point at the SkyHigh, but it didn't seem to be like a regular thing that they had.
I also like the mentioning, I always had thought that the decline in drive-ins was because of the rise of the movie multiplexes. But at least here in Indiana, and since I've been here for about 3.5 years now, you know, it doesn't get dark until 10 o'clock. And so the change in, you know, in the daylight savings, I think is really interesting, and a really interesting idea about being a issue for why the drive-ins had kind of declined over the years. So thank you. If anyone else has any questions, go ahead and put them into the chat, or we can wait till the end of the presentation. But we're going to go ahead and go on to our last presenter, who is me. And I'm going to be talking about Camp Eisenhower. So in 1961, farmland in Yorktown, Indiana was developed into a camp that specialized in summer programs for people with mental and physical disabilities. Camp Eisenhower welcomed campers of all ages, offering summer and off-season programs for children as well as teens and adults. Camp activities, which were adapted to the ages and abilities of the campers, included arts and crafts, nature studies, swimming, fishing, campfires, cookouts, overnight sleepouts, games, dances, music, basketball, gardening, and even obstacle courses. The goal of Camp Eisenhower was the emotional and physical well-being of each camper. All the programs were designed to promote spiritual, social, intellectual, and physical growth and development. The camp organizers wanted each camper to leave Eisenhower with enhanced self-esteem and improved potential for independence and self-sufficiency. In the summer of 1988, Camp Eisenhower introduced a new program designed to bring the visual and performing arts into a camp setting. This was an opportunity for campers to work with some local artists on a daily basis. This was made possible through a grant from Very Special Arts Indiana, which on the national and international scene is now VSA, and here in Indiana, now associated with Art Mix, Art Refining Disabilities. Very Special Arts, or VSA, is an organization on arts, education, and disability, which was founded in 1974 by former U.S. Ambassador to Ireland, Jean Kennedy Smith, sister to John F. and Robert F. Kennedy. VSA is a nonprofit dedicated to creating a society where people with disabilities can engage with the arts. In 2011, it became the Department of VSA and Accessibility at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. Through this grant, local artist Karen Toney made the Eisenhower Arts and Crafts program an exciting and creative experience. For 9 weeks, she introduced weaving, paper making, tie-dyeing, kite making, and paper flow construction to the campers. This same summer, Dr. Don Hetty, professor of drama at Ball State, was another visiting artist at the camp. Under his direction, campers presented excerpts from Romeo and Juliet, created their own play about Camp Eisenhower, did poetry readings, and a dance performance. Since its inception in 1961, the camp was funded and owned by the Easter Seal Society of Delaware County. In addition to owning and caring for the camp, the Easter Seal Society also raised funding for low-income campers who could not afford the camp fees. The camp was located on 15 acres of meadows and woodlands, which were at one time part of the John Eisenhower farm. In 1853, Ellen Eisenhower, a Delaware County teacher, donated the land to the Delaware County Easter Seal Society in memory of the John T. and Sarah Jane Eisenhower family, provided that the society use the property as a home or recreation ground for the enjoyment of physically handicapped children and adults. To fulfill this mission, Camp Eisenhower was built so that campers could function as independently as possible. The facilities included a large modern lodge for dining and recreation and 6 resident cabins. The cabins, activity rooms, restrooms, and showers were under one roof, providing easy access from cabins to all housed areas. Restrooms were handicap accessible. Concrete pathways connected the dining and living areas to more of the rustic parts of the camp, and the swimming pool had a double wheelchair ramp. As the 1980 brochure states, in short, Camp Eisenhower is completely accessible to both wheelchair users and those with limited mobility. Camp counselors were carefully selected college students trained to give special attention to the physical needs of handicapped campers and at the same time provide a fun schedule of activities. Most of the camp counselors were specialized in the fields of recreation, child development, therapy, and camping. The top staff included a recreation director, nurse, and an arts and crafts director whom provided inspiration and training in the joys of camping, along with the best possible physical care. In 2001, discussions between Eisenhower and Hillcroft Services regarding a partnership began. In the minutes from the board of directors, a motion was carried to move forward with acquisition negotiations. In a Star Press article dated November 27, 2006, it was announced that beginning in January of 2007, Hillcroft Services and the Eisenhower Center would become one and the same. The chairman of Eisenhower at the time, Steve Grurow, stated in a press release that the merger would enable both parties to do a better job of utilizing their common resources and the resources that would be donated in the future. By 2010, the camp hosted more than 200 campers from 30 Indiana counties. Despite its popularity with campers and fundraising efforts, the camp struggled to pay for yearly maintenance fees, and in 2014, Hillcroft Services announced that the camp would be closing after nearly 60 years of service. So all the images you have seen are a part of the archival collection, which was donated to the Ball State University Library's Archives and Special Collections in December of 2015. Lindsay Vesperi, who has presented in the series in the past, processed the collection consisting of 6 archival boxes that include brochures, newspaper clippings, newsletters, scrapbooks, video recordings, and a very, very large photograph collection. The collection is open for research, and anyone is welcome to come and visit the collection. So we would like to thank you for attending this evening. And if anyone has any other questions or comments, please feel free to put them into the chat or raise your hand. So on behalf of our presenters, we'd like to thank you for coming this evening. I think Sarah is going to put a link to a form survey that we have if you want to tell us how we did tonight or any other ideas that you might have about future presentations. We do plan to have a community presentation in the fall, so keep an eye out for additional information. And thank you for coming this evening.
Sarah, could I mention the history workshop? Is there an extra slide? Did you get that slide?
Is there? Oh, there it is. Sorry. Yeah, there you go, Melissa.
We're having a women's history workshop here in Bracken Library on July 15th. And it's called a workshop, but it's more just a collaboration where we're going to be talking about some of the notable women projects that we've been doing over the last, it's been 3 years. And anyone's welcome to join. And we basically just want to create a network where more people can get involved in using the notable women and celebrating them. And I see you, Jeff Kinker, and you can come in person or you can come via Zoom. So you can sign up on the Ball State Library page.
So real quick, Wendy asked why the camp was named Eisenhower. That was the name of the family farm that it was located on. And Ellen Eisenhower, who was their daughter, was John and Sarah's daughter. She donated the land to the Easter Seals Association. So that was why it was called Eisenhower. And in some of the brochures and even in newspaper articles, they phonetically spell the name Eisenhower because I think people did not quite know how to pronounce it. I didn't actually quite know how to pronounce it either. Lindsay had to keep saying it to me before I got it right. But the brochures would have it phonetically spelled. So I thought that was kind of fun. So if there aren't any more questions, we really thank you for joining us this evening. And as Jeff said, you missed the first 20 minutes. It's recorded and will be available in the Ball State Digital Media Repository. And you will also receive a link to the YouTube video once it gets up in there since you've registered for the session. So again, on behalf of all of our presenters this evening, I want to thank you for joining us and we hope to see you in the fall. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Everyone.